A year ago, I sat down in front of a microphone and started a podcast. I didn't really know exactly what it was going to become. I knew the kinds of things I wanted to talk about: history, spirituality, mythology, symbols, the strange patterns that seem to repeat across cultures and across time. And I knew I wanted to create a place where we could explore those things without immediately deciding what they meant. A place where curiosity could come before certainty, where we could look at something strange or ancient or difficult to explain and simply ask, what do we notice? And somehow here we are, 1 year later. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. And today is a little different, because this week marks 1 year since this podcast began. So rather than opening another door into history or mythology, I thought we might look back at some of the doors we already walked through. When I started this podcast, I don't think I completely understood what I was building. The earliest episodes were questions I couldn't stop thinking about: ancient symbols, biblical stories, historical mysteries, psychic phenomena, music, and mythology. The kinds of subjects that can sit in completely different sections of a bookstore, but somehow keep bumping into one another in my mind. And slowly the podcast began to change. Or maybe it began to reveal what it had been all along. Because the more subjects we explored, the more I started noticing something. The individual topics were interesting, but the patterns between them were even more interesting. The same symbols would appear in different places. Similar stories would emerge across cultures. Civilizations would wrestle with remarkably familiar problems. Spiritual teachers separated by centuries would ask surprisingly similar questions. Nature would repeat patterns that human history seemed to echo in completely different ways. And eventually, I realized I wasn't really making a podcast about strange things. I was making a podcast about patterns, about what human beings keep discovering, forgetting, preserving, and sometimes discovering again. And I think I've changed along with it. When this began, I felt much more pressure to find answers, to figure out what something meant, to determine which explanation was correct. But somewhere along the way, I became much more interested in the question itself. I've learned that two things can look remarkably similar without being identical. That finding a pattern doesn't automatically explain the pattern. That history becomes more interesting when we allow it to remain complicated. And that saying, I don't know, doesn't end an investigation. Sometimes it's where the investigation actually begins. That's probably one of the greatest gifts this podcast has given me: permission to remain curious. And there's something else I've noticed over this first year. For all the strange places we've gone, a surprisingly gentle idea keeps appearing underneath them. Again and again, we find people trying to preserve something that gives life, wisdom, relationship, compassion, truth, community, memory, hope. Sometimes civilizations lose those things. Sometimes people distort them. Sometimes institutions built to protect them eventually forget why they were built. Sometimes something actively seems to resist them. But then someone remembers. Someone asks another question. Someone carries an old story forward. Someone rebuilds. Someone teaches. Someone notices. Someone chooses differently. And life begins moving again. I didn't plan for that idea to appear so often, but it has. And maybe that's one of the things that I've learned making this show. Some things survive not only because they are powerful, but because someone quietly remembers them. And that brings me to you. Because a podcast doesn't really exist in the microphone. It exists somewhere between the person speaking and the person listening. Every time you've watched an episode, listened while driving, sent one to somebody, left a comment, disagreed with me, asked a question, or simply carried an idea with you after the episode ended, you became part of this little experiment. And I don't take that lightly. There are a lot of places on the internet where someone will confidently tell you exactly what reality is. That has never been what I wanted this place to become. I wanted somewhere we could say, here's something interesting. Here's what history tells us. Here's what this tradition says. Here's another tradition that sees it differently. Here's a pattern. Here's a contradiction. Here's something we don't understand yet. Now, what do you notice? And you've allowed me to build that kind of space. So thank you. And we're not finished yet. Not even close. There are still so many rooms I want to walk through with you. More history, more mythology, more spiritual traditions, more psychology, more strange intersections between ideas that shouldn't necessarily belong together and somehow do. Some questions will probably lead somewhere. Others won't. Some patterns will hold up when we examine them closely. Others may disappear. And occasionally, we'll probably find something neither of us expected. And that's the fun of it. Because I don't think curiosity needs to know the destination before it begins walking. Sometimes it simply needs a doorway. A year ago, I began this podcast because I was curious about the hidden, the occult, the things beneath the surface, the stories behind the stories. But after a year of doing this, I think I've become equally interested in the revealed. The things that were never really hidden at all. The patterns sitting quietly in history, in nature, in stories, in one another, waiting for someone to notice them. Maybe that's what this podcast has been teaching me all along. That understanding doesn't always come from discovering something completely new. Sometimes it comes from learning to see something familiar differently. And so 1 year later, I think the invitation remains exactly the same. Stay curious, keep asking questions, Notice the patterns, hold your conclusions gently, and see what happens when we place seemingly unrelated things beside one another and simply look. Thank you for spending this first year with me. Whether you've been here since the beginning or this is the first episode you've heard, I'm really glad you're here. And if there's a question, mystery, tradition, historical moment, or strange little thread that you think we should follow in year 2, leave it for me in the comments. I have a feeling we're going to find some interesting places together. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Here's to year 2. See you there.